The episode you've been waiting for is finally here. Today we're going to be talking about comparators, including how to use them to make item sorters. Hi, I'm MistRazor, and welcome back to Redstone from Zero, a series where I teach you Redstone from its foundations, assuming you come in knowing absolutely nothing about it. As always, I recommend that newcomers start at episode 0, but I'll do my best to be comprehensible even if you haven't. Anyway, let's talk comparators. Unlike the hopper from the previous episode, which pretty much just does one thing, comparators have 4 main functions: power stabilization, measurement, comparison, and subtraction. We're going to cover power stabilization and measurement in this episode, and we'll cover comparison and subtraction in the next one. To start with, looking at a comparator, it might not be immediately obvious which side it reads from, and which side it outputs to. One way to remember is that when you place a comparator, its redstone output signal flows in the same direction you were facing when you placed it, meaning the side further from you is the output, and the side closer to you is the input. Another way to remember it is the mnemonic, 2 eyes, 1 mouth. The side of the comparator with 2 lights is the eyes. Whatever that side is pointing at, that's what the comparator is looking at, or in other words, the input. The side of the comparator with 1 light is the mouth. That side tells what the eyes see, or in other words, the output. The other 2 sides that are neither eyes nor mouth, we can just call the sides. The sides are secondary inputs, and if they're hooked up, that tells you the comparator is being used for comparison or subtraction. And since comparison and subtraction always involve the side inputs, we can safely ignore them until comparators part 2. So let's start by talking about power stabilization, which is pretty quick and straightforward. Like a repeater, a comparator adds 1 redstone tick of delay between its input and its output. Unlike a repeater, you can't raise the delay, it's always 1 redstone tick. And also unlike a repeater, a comparator that takes a redstone signal in as its input will output the same signal strength 1 redstone tick later. This means if you hook up 4 comparators like this, any redstone signal sent into one of the blocks will circulate through the 4 comparators forever, without changing. It's like plugging a power strip into itself, except it actually works. But that particular configuration is not very useful. What's more useful is if you include just enough redstone dust that the signal decays a little bit. That will allow us to build a pulse lengthener. We used a repeater for pulse lengthening before, but that's limited to 1 to 4 redstone ticks. With comparators, we can make the pulse as long as we want. Basically, if you start with an input signal strength of 15, and your comparator loop has 2 connected redstone dust like this, the signal strength will decay by 1 every time the signal completes a lap around the circuit. You can't include repeaters in the circuit, because they'd pull the signal back up to 15 every time. So to make the signal longer, chain multiple pulse lengtheners connected by repeaters. That way, the input signal to the second pulse lengthener stays at 15 until the first pulse lengthener has gone down to 0. To make the signal shorter, add more redstone dust to the loop so it decays more quickly. To see that in action, notice how the pulse lengthener with 2 dusts on each side decays twice as fast as the pulse lengthener with 2 dust on only one side, because the power level doesn't decay at all on the side with the strongly powered smooth stone block. Something to keep in mind, though, is that comparators don't tend to play nice with 1-tick pulses. So if you're going to have an observer output into a pulse lengthener, I recommend using a repeater between the 2 to lengthen the 1-tick pulse. Next, let's talk about measurement. A huge amount of the time, especially for newer redstoners, comparators are used for their measuring capability rather than their comparison ability, despite being called comparators. A comparator looking at any container will measure how full it is, with one exception: the crafter. For the crafter, a comparator will tell you how many slots are occupied, by an ingredient or by being disabled, up to a maximum of 9, if all slots are occupied and/or disabled. We'll go in depth on crafters when they get their own lesson. For now, I just wanted to warn you that comparators read from them differently than from other containers, so you don't get tripped up expecting them to be the same. Anyway, back to measuring container fullness. When a comparator is pointing at a block with an inventory, let's say a chest, it outputs a redstone signal from 0 to 15, depending on how full the chest is. A completely empty chest will give a comparator output of 0. A completely full chest will give a comparator output of 15. All chest fullness amounts in between those two will correspond to comparator outputs from 1 to 14. You don't need to have them memorized. I certainly don't. Just look up the container you want to use on minecraft.wiki/comparator to find out what fullness amounts correspond to what comparator output levels. It's all based on the number of item slots in the container, by the way. So if a dispenser and a dropper, which both have 9 slots, have filled up the same amount, they will each output the same comparator value. By the way, There's a reason I keep saying container fullness rather than number of items, and the reason for that is that different types of items count differently. More specifically, it counts by fractions of a stack rather than by the actual number of items, meaning that to a comparator, 64 stone, which stacks to 64, counts the same as 16 ender pearls, which stack to 16, which also counts the same as a wooden shovel, which is unstackable, because each of those fill a slot completely. In other words, you can think of a block of stone as 1 stack unit, an ender pearl as 4 stack units, and a shovel or any other unstackable item as 64 stack units. So from now on, when I give a quantity of items, I mean items that stack to 64 unless otherwise specified. Something else to know about comparators is that they can measure a container through a single solid block when needed, meaning both this and this will measure how full their chests are. Transparent blocks, on the other hand, won't work, so keep that in mind. Okay, now that I have all that out of the way, I know a lot of you in the comments are raring to go with item filters, so let's talk specifically about measuring hoppers, since they are the most important container when it comes to item filters/item sorters. For a hopper's 5 slots, 0 items gives a comparator output of 0. 1 to 22 items gives an output of 1, 23 to 45 items gives an output of 2, and 46 to 68 items gives an output of 3. These are the only values that matter for an item sorter, by the way. Again, no need to memorize these. I'll have the table on screen when needed. We'll start with the most basic item sorter, a sorter that works, but has some problems. We'll work through those problems together until we arrive at the optimal item sorter, the one I recommend using. The reason for going through this process is so you'll be able to see exactly why each part of the item sorter is the way it is, so if you need to adapt it to various circumstances, you'll be able to. You'll know what you can safely cut depending on your use case, and likewise what you need to keep. The basic item sorter and optimal item sorter operate on the same principles, so I'd recommend not skipping forward until after I've gone through the anatomy of the basic item sorter, but here's the timestamp of the optimal item sorter in case you want to skip to it anyway. I'll put the timestamp on screen again after the anatomy explanation as well, since I personally think that's a better time to skip to it, if you're going to. The basic item sorter looks like this. A hopper points sideways into a comparator, and the comparator reads from the hopper. The comparator output goes down a redstone dust line that drops down by 1 over solid building blocks. They're solid because the blocks need to be able to be powered by the redstone dust. That lower building block is the key to all of this, by the way. It'll make sense in a minute, but for now, just remember that the lower building block is important. There's a repeater coming out of the lower building block, which will pull power out when the lower building block becomes weakly powered by the redstone dust on top of it. The repeater propagates any of that redstone power forward to the block in front of it, which holds the redstone torch. Remember that redstone torches are inverters, so whenever the lower building block is unpowered, the torch will be on, and whenever the lower building block is powered, the torch will be off. Both of these are after a 1-tick delay from the repeater, of course. Below the first hopper is a second hopper that points into your storage, or into a hopper chain that leads to your storage. For now, we'll just have it pointing into a barrel, which is where the sorted items go. The lower hopper gets powered, and therefore locked, by the redstone torch whenever the redstone torch is on. Combining that information with the conditions of when the torch is powered, we can see that when the lower building block gets powered, the lower hopper becomes unlocked after a 1-tick delay. Taking this back yet another step, we can see that the lower building block gets powered when the comparator's output is 2 or greater. An output of 1 doesn't quite reach it. And since it takes 23 items for a hopper to give a comparator output of 2, we can see, finally, that no items will flow through the sorter as long as there are 22 or fewer items in the upper hopper. Okay, if you want to skip to the optimal item sorter, here's the timestamp. So let's see what happens when a stream of the item we want, let's say iron ingots, passes over the hopper. The upper hopper collects iron ingots as they pass, but since it's pointing into the comparator, it can't push them anywhere. So they start to stack up inside the upper hopper's inventory. They stack up in the first slot because hoppers both fill and drain from left to right. And at first, the comparator outputs a signal strength of 1. But when 23 iron ingots have stacked up in the first slot, the comparator starts outputting a signal strength of 2. This powers the lower building block, which powers the repeater, which turns off the redstone torch, which unlocks the lower hopper. The lower hopper pulls an iron ingot from the upper hopper. And now the upper hopper only has 22 ingots, so the comparator output drops to power level 1 again, meaning the lower block becomes unpowered, meaning the redstone torch turns back on and locks the lower hopper. So now we have 22 ingots in the upper hopper and 1 in the lower hopper. Another ingot happens by, so the upper hopper has 23 ingots again. So the comparator output goes back to 2, powering the lower block, turning off the torch, and unlocking the lower hopper. The lower hopper pushes an iron ingot into the barrel and pulls another ingot from the upper hopper. Remember, hoppers push before they pull. I'm sure that you can see now that whenever we have more than 22 ingots in the upper hopper, the lower hopper will unlock and start pushing ingots into the barrel and pulling ingots out of the upper hopper. Things are looking good. The problem is, if our item stream is already all iron ingots, why do we need an item sorter to begin with? So let's update the item stream. Now it contains both iron ingots, which we want, and rotten flesh, which we don't want. When an iron ingot happens by, everything happens the same as before. The ingots stack up to 23, the lower hopper unlocks, everything's great. But then a rotten flesh shows up. It doesn't stack with the iron ingots in the first slot, so it falls into the second slot. But now there are 23 items in the upper hopper, and the comparator doesn't know the difference between iron ingots and rotten flesh. They're each just 1/64th of a stack per item as far as it's concerned. So since there are 23 of them, it increases its signal strength to 2. The lower hopper pushes an iron ingot into the chest and pulls an iron ingot from the upper hopper, because again, hoppers fill and drain from left to right, and now there are 21 ingots and 1 flesh in the upper hopper. Now we have a problem. The hopper is going to accumulate more and more rotten flesh, and when there are 23 rotten flesh inside of it, it doesn't matter how much iron there is, the rotten flesh will eventually start making its way into the lower hopper and then into the barrel. So that's bad. But we can deal with this problem. Instead of filling our upper hopper with 22 iron ingots and leaving 4 empty slots, we can put 18 iron ingots in the first slot and 1 iron ingot in each of the other slots. Now the rotten flesh can't get in at all. It doesn't matter how much rotten flesh there is, because there are no empty slots. Problem solved, right? Well, no, not exactly. Consider what happens if we get a sudden flood of iron ingots before the item stream goes back to its normal amount of iron and rotten flesh. The iron stacks up and stacks up and stacks up, faster than the lower hopper can remove it. Eventually we get to the point where slot 1 is completely full, and slot 2 starts filling up. If slot 2 doesn't fill up too much, we might be okay. But once slot 2 has 19 ingots in it, it's game over. I'll show you why. Slot 2 has 19 ingots, and there's 1 ingot in slots 3, 4, and 5. 19 plus 3 is 22, which means that as long as there's a single item in slot 1, the comparator output will be at least 2. Slot 1 will empty completely before the comparator output goes back to 1 and locks the lower hopper, meaning there will be an empty slot the rotten flesh can start piling up in. So that's not the solution, but it's on the right track. Let's use a different item than iron ingots in the other 4 slots. Let's say sticks. So the upper hopper can never hold more than 1 stack of iron. That will prevent the problem of spillover into slot 2 unintentionally leaving slot 1 open. Since only slot 1 can contain iron, the other 4 slots are already occupied by sticks. So, problem solved? You might be expecting me to say no again, but it's actually more of a maybe. The question is this: could the item stream ever have sticks in it? If so, problem not solved. Very much not solved. Let's see what happens if sticks are in the item stream. The hopper pulls in both iron and sticks from the item stream. The iron piles up in slot 1 and sticks pile up in slot 2. But once there are 19 sticks in slot 2, slot 1 becomes empty again, just like in the previous scenario. Then what item can we put into those other 4 slots to block the rotten flesh? Do we need to use nether stars because they're very rare, and if those break our sorter, at least we'll have a bunch of nether stars? Nope, not necessary. All we need is a friendly neighborhood anvil. Renamed items don't stack with other items of the same type unless they have exactly the same name. So if you take a stack of sticks and rename them Keep Out, or Placeholder, or Fahuquagods, they'll only stack with other sticks with the same name. So unless you have an item stream full of Fahuquagod sticks to deal with, problem actually solved this time. Well, this problem is solved. There's a second problem we haven't discussed yet. To show that problem, let's say we want to sort out both iron and sticks from our hypothetical iron, stick, and rotten flesh item stream. We set up 2 item sorters next to each other, with chests that are next to each other. And once again, we get a flood of iron. It completely fills the first slot, 64 iron, but since the other slots are full of renamed sticks, it's okay. The iron sorter will survive unscathed. But let's look at the redstone dust. This is because we have 64 iron and 4 sticks in the hopper, 68 items total. So the redstone dust touching the comparator has a power level of 3, and the lower block has a power level of 2. Once there's fewer than 46 items, the comparator output will drop to power level 2, and the lower block will have a power level of 1. But until then, the redstone dust on the lower block will have a power level of 2, which will power the redstone dust on the block next to it. which will unlock the lower hopper of the stick sorter, draining from its upper hopper beyond the point we want it to. Once there's an empty slot in the upper hopper of the stick sorter, it will start to accumulate whatever items come by, whether that's sticks or rotten flesh. The same problem could occur from the iron storage completely filling up, by the way. If it reaches the point where the upper hopper is accumulating iron with nowhere else for it to go. If the upper hopper ever contains more than 41 iron, no matter the cause, it's going to force the stick sorter's lower hopper to unlock, which will break the stick sorter. So how do we solve this problem? There are two possible solutions. One is to separate the two sorters by a 1-block gap. This will prevent any crosstalk in the redstone lines, meaning the iron sorter or the stick sorter can fill up as much as they want without affecting each other. But this solution has the drawback of requiring a gap between each item sorter, which doubles the horizontal space requirement of an auto-sorted storage system. The second solution was invented by Impulse SV, and is the one I recommend using, the item sorter with overflow protection. The key difference here is that the lower block that controls the hopper locking torch is 3 spaces away from the comparator instead of 2. That means instead of staying stable at 22 items, the impulse sorter is stable at 45 items. So you'll need 41 of your desired item instead of 18, but since you can never go above 68 items, 64 of your item plus 4 sticks, which uses up all 5 slots, and since the comparator output for a hopper reaches 4 at 69 items, it's impossible to reach the point where the comparator outputs a power level of 4 and starts messing up adjacent item sorters by powering their lower blocks. And building an impulse sorter couldn't be easier. All you have to do is take the basic item sorter and put a building block right above the torch. Then move the comparator, and put redstone dust where it used to be. And there, you've converted the basic sorter into an impulse sorter. One thing to know about the impulse sorter is that instead of the redstone torch directly locking the hopper, the redstone torch strongly powers the building block, and that building block is what locks the hopper. Before we move on to our last topic, some of the commenters on the last video wanted me to explain hopper clock chaining, and since it uses container measurement with comparators, I thought I'd squeeze it in. In short, just build 2 vertical etho hopper clocks, and use a comparator pointing from one hopper clock's hopper to the others. Since you'll recall that each hopper is only empty for a short amount of time, actually the amount of time it takes for one item to move between hoppers, that means that the comparator connecting the 2 hopper clocks will only unpower once per full clock cycle of the first clock, just long enough for a single item to move between hoppers in the second clock. That's another way of saying that a chained clock cycle is multiplied by the cycle of the clock chained to it, meaning that if the second clock has 5 items and the first clock has 10 items, the second clock will operate at the same frequency as a clock with 50 items. And since you can chain as many hopper clocks in a row as you want, you can use this method to make really long-running clocks. Give it a try sometime. The last thing I want to talk about is the comparator's ability to measure things other than containers. They can measure beehives or nests, cakes, cauldrons, chiseled bookshelves, composters, copper bulbs, command blocks, crafters, creaking hearts, end portal frames, item frames, jukeboxes, lecterns, respawn anchors, and skulk sensors. And if pointing at a detector rail, they can measure chest mine carts and hopper mine carts that are on the detector rail. Of these, I'm planning to give copper bulbs, crafters, and skulk sensors their own episodes, and I'll talk about item frames, jukeboxes, and lecterns in just a second. Other than those, I'd recommend just looking at minecraft.wiki/comparator to see the various output values a comparator will give for those blocks' different states. When reading from an item frame, a comparator looks at the angle of the item in the frame and outputs a value from 1 to 8. It starts out at 1 and increases by 1 each time you right-click it to rotate it once, resetting back to 1 once it reaches its initial position again. In the case of maps, you have to rotate a map twice to get back to a comparator output of 1, because unlike everything else, maps rotate 90 degrees at a time, so the first 360-degree rotation only gets you to a comparator output of 5. When reading from a jukebox, the output power level is determined by what music disc is playing. I'd look up which discs output which values, because I certainly don't remember off the top of my head. And last, but definitely not least, when reading from a lectern, the output power level is determined by how far you are in the book that's currently on the lectern. It'll be 1 when you're 1/15th of the way through the book, 2 when you're 2/15ths of the way through the book, and so on. This is particularly useful when you want a redstone signal of a specific strength. I recommend creating a writable book with 15 pages, each labeled with numbers 1 through 15 that you can place in a lectern and turn the pages until you get the exact signal strength you want. For a signal strength of 9, just turn to page 9. Easy. This is a common practice for compacting redstone, so definitely keep the lectern in mind when it comes to comparators. Normally, this is where I'd show you something cool you can build with comparators and/or item sorters, but This time, instead of doing that, I'm going to show you a really cool item sorter you may not have even considered possible. It's an item sorter based on hopper carts, meaning it's fast. About 4 times as fast as the item sorters you've seen in this episode so far. This is the hopper cart sorter by Just Panda. I'm going to explain how it works, but for a step-by-step build tutorial, I recommend just watching his video. There are only 3 basic differences between the hopper cart sorter and the Impulse SV sorter with overflow protection. The first is that we're using the gravel trick with a hopper cart again, to split the items across 4 regular hoppers. If I turn on bounding boxes with F3B, you can see that the hopper cart's bounding box is over all 4 hoppers, meaning all 4 hoppers will pull from the hopper cart. The second is that we're using an activator rail with a hopper cart instead of a lower hopper. The activator rail locks the hopper cart when powered, just like powering a regular hopper. The third difference is that we're using a detector rail with a hopper cart instead of an upper hopper. The detector rail allows the comparator to read the hopper cart's contents the same as if it were a regular hopper. Other than that, you can see that this is doing the same thing in the same way as the Impulse SV sorter. It's just much, much faster. Check it out! Pretty nifty, huh? Alright, before we end, let's review what we talked about today. 1. If the only input to a comparator is from the back, the eyes, it's being used for measurement or stabilization, not comparison or subtraction. 2. Comparators add a delay of 1 redstone tick, and unless powered from the side, the input and output signal strength will be the same. 3. Comparators can measure through a single solid block. 4. Comparators care about container fullness, not item count. 8 ender pearls counts for more than 8 saplings. 5. The only problem with item sorters that can't be solved by using renamed placeholder items in slots 2 through 5 is overflow in sorter B, making its neighbors, sorters A and C, empty. Use the 1 block longer Impulse SV design for a robust item sorter with overflow protection. If there's an air gap of at least 1 block between your sorters, you don't have to worry about overflow protection. 6. Use a 15-page book on a lectern to get whatever comparator output you want. Whatever page number you select will also be the comparator's output power level. As always, if you have a question or are confused about something, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain it to you. If you enjoyed this episode and think it deserves a like, I greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe as well. It helps out the channel a lot. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!